Stories told about a man who worked for the post office. The man's job was to process all the mail that had illegible addresses. So one day a letter came across his desk. It was addressed in a shaky handwriting to God. He thought he should open the letter and see what it was all about. So when he opens the letter, this is what he reads. Dear God, I am a 93-year-old widow living on a very small pension. Yesterday, someone stole my purse. It had $100 in it, which was all the money I had until my next pension check. Next Sunday is Christmas, and I had invited 2 of my friends over for dinner. Without that money, I have nothing to buy food with. I have no family to turn to, and you are my only help. Can you please help me, God? Sincerely, Edna. Well, the postal worker was touched. He showed the letter to his fellow workers. Each of them dug into their wallets, came up with a few dollars. By the time he made the rounds, he collected $96, which he put in an envelope. He sent it to the woman. The rest of the day, all the workers felt this warm feeling inside because they had done something to help somebody else. Christmas came, Christmas went. A few days later, another letter from the old lady addressed to God came. When the letter was opened, this is what it read. Dear God, how can I ever thank you enough for what you did for me? Because of your gift of love, I was able to fix a glorious dinner for my friends. We had a very nice day, and I told my friends of your wonderful gift. By the way, God, there was $4 missing. I think it must have been those thieves at the post office. Sincerely, Edna. That was a lady who needed help. A lady who asked God for help. And maybe I'm talking to somebody today. You need help too. Maybe there's something in your life that you've been praying for. And you've been praying for. Maybe you've been praying for years. And it seems like the silence is just deafening. And you wonder, is God ever going to do the impossible, the miraculous in your life? Well, I've got good news. Good news today from our text in Luke chapter 1. Find Luke chapter 1 with me if you will, please. Luke chapter 1, and while you're finding it, let me set the background for you. Luke has a very methodical way of writing the gospel. Luke interviews a lot of people, and more than anything, Luke is interested in the fact that Jesus was fully human. John gets all theological. Luke really doesn't. Luke is very intent on finding out more about this man, fully human, who was God in the flesh. Luke tells us that he uses sources for his gospel. One of those sources, I think, was Mary. And I think as Mary and Luke were talking, Mary said, Luke, I've got the perfect person for you to talk to. Luke, I want you to go to a relative's house of mine. Her name is Elizabeth, because she's got a story, Luke, you need to hear. Luke is the only one who tells us the story of Elizabeth and Zachariah. And what Luke is doing here is he is telling the miraculous story of the other miraculous birth. In the Old Testament, the last book of the Bible, the last page of the Old Testament, Malachi 4 verses 5 and 6, Malachi says this, I will send you the prophet Elijah before that great and dreadful day of the Lord comes. And he will turn the hearts of his fathers to their children, and the hearts of the children to their fathers. So 400 years before Jesus comes, God gives the Old Testament Jews a final promise that the Messiah would come, and that before the Messiah comes, Elijah would come back. Now there has been 400 years that has gone by. 400 years and God sends no angel. 400 years and God sends no prophet. 400 years and God sends no message at all. The Jews are waiting. The Jews are praying. The Jews are hoping that the Messiah would come. They're looking and nothing seems to happen. But in Luke chapter 1, the silence breaks. Look at verse 5. Verse 5 says, in the days of King Herod of Judea, there was a priest named Zechariah. His wife was from the daughters of Aaron, and her name was Elizabeth. Both were righteous in God's sight, living without blame according to all the commandments and requirements of the Lord. But they had no children, because Elizabeth could not conceive, and both of them were along in years. So here we have the couple. We have Elizabeth and Zechariah. Now the name Zechariah means this. Don't forget it. God remembers. The name Elizabeth means this. God's oath. We learn later that they lived in the hills of Judea. They would have been considered, to the Jerusalem crowd, hillbillies, basically. They would have been considered the hillbilly people. We're told that they're very devout, they're very religious, they live good lives. But there was one problem with them. Zechariah and Elizabeth faced a trial. They had no children. In Bible times, there was a huge stigma if a couple had no children. And you know who they blamed? The woman. Always. In fact, they had this special word for a woman who had no children. They called her barren. And even that word conjures up an image of a dry wind blowing across this lifeless desert. Now, I think Zechariah and Elizabeth prayed. I think they prayed for a child. I think they thought God would answer their prayer. And I think as they looked at the calendar, their birthdays came around. And eventually Zechariah and Elizabeth said, okay, there's no use to pray anymore. And you know what I think they did? I think they stopped praying. I think they stopped praying because they thought it was impossible. They had forgotten what we forget sometimes, that God specializes in the impossible. There's one word that God doesn't understand, and that's the word impossible. Because nothing is impossible with God. When the doctor says there's nothing else we can do, then God can step in. When the checkbook is so low and the bills are coming due, God can step in. There is nothing impossible with God. I want you to notice something about these folks too, though. They were old. They were along in years. They were elderly people. And we're going to see in the text, God still had a plan for them. You've heard me say this before. You will hear me say this again. God never calls anybody just to sit down. God never calls anybody to retire. You are never so old that God can't do something through you and in you. God sees these two old folks, and God says, I am going to do something great through them. Just when they thought it was time to retire, God says, you're not going to retire. In fact, I'm going to use you to do the miraculous. Look at verse 8. Verse 8 says, when his division, talking about Zechariah, was on duty and he was serving as a priest, it happened that he was chosen by lot, according to the custom of the priesthood, to enter the sanctuary of the Lord to burn incense. At the hour of incense, the whole assembly of people was praying outside. An angel of the Lord appeared to him, standing to the right of the altar of incense. And when Zechariah saw him, he was startled and overcome with fear. If you want to see God do the impossible in your life, there are 3 steps we see in Zechariah's life. This is the first one: worship. Worship. Now, in the days when Zechariah was living, there were thousands of priests. The priestly duties had been divided up according to the priestly order. If you want to read all about that when you get home, look up 1 Chronicles 24. Tells you all about it. Well, it was finally time for Zechariah's order to perform the temple duties. Basically, in this time, the priest would live normal lives except for 2 months of the year. So they would live wherever they lived, and then 2 weeks of the year, they would pack up, they would come to Jerusalem, and they would do the works of the priest. Now, Zechariah's old, Elizabeth's old, so I imagine that Zechariah, he's getting Elizabeth to pack everything he needs, and he says, "You going to be okay when I'm gone, honey?" And she's got a little walker there, and she says, "Yes, I'll be okay." And he goes to the neighbors, says, "Now don't you forget to look in after Elizabeth, because I'm going to be gone for 2 weeks." Now I can imagine everybody in the village said, "Well, we got to look after Elizabeth because she has nobody else. She's barren. She's barren, you know. So she has no child. Zechariah's got to go do his work. We'll go look in on Elizabeth." So Zechariah goes. He's in Jerusalem. He's at the temple. They're deciding by lot, drawing straws, picking out a number, basically. Which priest gets to go to burn the incense? Some priests went their whole lives and never got to do that. Burning incense was so important that if you were ever chosen as a priest once, you never got to do it again. Some never ever got to do it. But this was the day of Zechariah's life. He chose the right straw, the right lot, and he got to do the burning of incense. You can only imagine what Zechariah was feeling like. On one hand, he must have been rejoicing. What a high privilege it was. But on the other hand, he is probably reading Leviticus chapter 10. Leviticus chapter 10 has that story about the deaths of Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu. Remember that story? Nadab and Abihu are offering strange fire to the Lord. Remember what happened to them? They died. They were burning incense when that happened. That was exactly what Zechariah was going to do the next day. So he's so excited with such a privilege. But he's so nervous too, because God takes this very seriously. Incense was very important. Incense represented 2 things for the Jews. First of all, incense represented their prayers. When you would burn incense, it would go up. It would fill, the smoke would fill the whole room, and there would be 2 little areas on each side of the room where the incense would go out. And everybody else was outside of the room, and they were praying, and they looked, and they saw the smoke going up, and to them, that represented their prayers. Incense also made a huge smoke. And in fact, today, many Orthodox Christians still use incense. If you go, for example, to the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, they're always burning incense. And you walk in and you smell it, and it burns your eyes. It gets on your skin. When you breathe, you can almost taste it. When you leave, you still smell like it. When you leave, you can still taste it. When you leave, it's still on you. That's what worship is all about. Worship is all about having an encounter with God that makes you leave different. And everybody else can see it and smell it and sense it on you. And that's what Zechariah was doing that day. Between him, where he was at the holy place. And between there was a thick curtain. And right inside was the Holy of Holies where God dwelt. Zechariah was as close to the holy place, the Holy of Holies, as he ever would be, because only the high priest could go in there. I imagine he's shaking, he's nervous, he lights the whatever he's going to use to light the incense with. He looks, and all of a sudden, there stands Gabriel. If you were here Wednesday night, you know that what the angel says first, every time in the Bible, is this: fear not. Why? Because it must have scared Zechariah out of his wits. And let's be honest, we see if you go to your car and there's an angel sitting there, how many of you are just, oh, look, there's an angel? No, you're going to be scared to death. So the first thing the angel says to Zechariah is fear not. And incidentally, whenever we come to worship, that's one of the first things God ever says to us. Fear not. Maybe you've come to worship today and your stomach is all in knots about some doctor's appointment you've got or something that's going on with your children or your grandchildren. Listen very closely. And you may hear God whisper to you, fear not. Fear not. Fear not. Because when you're really with God, you can hear God whispering, don't be afraid. I'm here. I'll take care of you. And as David said, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will do not what? I won't fear. Why? God's with me. The steps to seeing God do the impossible. Number one is worship. Number two is wonder. The angel says, Zechariah, don't be afraid. Then he says something else. Zechariah, verse 13. Do not be afraid, Zechariah, because your prayer has been heard. What prayer do you think the angel was talking about? You think he was talking about the prayer of a son? I don't. Because I think Zechariah had stopped praying for that years ago. And remember, Zechariah is a priest as Zechariah is burning the incense. Zechariah is praying on behalf of the whole nation. You know what I think Zechariah is praying for? I think he's praying for the same thing that all those out there are praying for. He's praying for the Messiah to come. He's praying for God to send the Messiah. And the angel Gabriel comes and says, Zechariah, your prayer has been heard because God's about to send a Messiah. And you know what? God's going to give him a son too. God is such a great God. Not only is he going to answer the prayer of Zechariah, I think he's going to give him a son too. Your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you will name him John. Verse 14, there will be joy and delight for you, and many will rejoice at his birth. He'll be great in the sight of the Lord. He'll be a Nazarene, basically. And the angel goes on and begins to describe all that John will do. But I want you to look at verse 18. Now, verse 18 is amazing to me. Zechariah is as close to the presence of God as you'll ever get. He looks and he sees an angel standing there. An angel says, God has heard your prayer. I think if I ever would believe in prayer, that would be the moment. But you know what Zechariah says? How can I know this? There's an angel standing right there before you, Zechariah. That's one way. But he says, how can I know this? For I am an old man, and my wife is well along in years. I wish we could all read the original Greek there. Because what Zechariah says is this. Zechariah says, I'm old. And he uses the typical word for old. He says, I'm old, but the real problem is my wife. She's well beyond years. My wife is, she's old. She's old as the hills. She's older than dirt. He uses the regular word for old for him. But the word he uses for old when it comes to Elizabeth, the years have taken the toll on her. So he's even blaming her. In verse 19, Gabriel is not amused. Gabriel says, I am Gabriel, who stands in the presence of God, and I was sent to speak this for you. Now listen. Verse 20, you will become silent and unable to speak until the day these things take place, because you did not believe my words, which will be fulfilled in the proper time. 2 miracles. An old lady's going to give birth, and a preacher's going to be quiet for 9 months. I don't know which is the greatest miracle. Well, all the people are outside. They're waiting for Zechariah to come back out. Now remember, they all know the story in Leviticus 2. They know what happened to Nadab and Abihu. They know that they offered strange fire to the Lord and they died. In fact, some scholars say, it's not provable, but some scholars say that whenever you went to burn incense, they would tie a little rope around your foot. So if something did happen to you and you did die, they wouldn't have to go in after you. They could just pull you out because they didn't want to have to go that far into the presence of God. They're all waiting for Zechariah to come out. This must have taken longer than it usually did because he's standing there arguing with an angel. When he comes out, he can't speak. He can't speak. And he's at a crossroads. Steps to seeing God do the miraculous in your life. Number 1, worship. Number 2, wonder. Now here's where Zechariah is at the crossroads. And number 3 is willingness. If Zechariah had went home and done nothing, all he would be remembered by as the priest who God struck silent when he was burning incense at the altar. Don't get the virgin birth of Jesus and the regular birth of John the Baptist confused, okay? Mary was a virgin. Elizabeth was not. Mary's child, Jesus, had no earthly father. Elizabeth's child did. Mary's child was conceived by the Holy Spirit. But now Zechariah has the choice. God has told him he wants to do the impossible in his life. Now it's up to Zechariah to go home and do the very things that he needs to do so Elizabeth can bear a child. That's where a lot of people drop the ball. They come to worship. They receive the word. And they go home and they never do anything about it. It was up to Zechariah to go home and to do the very things he needed to do to help God's plan come into being. Well, they go home. And as soon as he walks in, you know what he said to Elizabeth? Nothing, because he couldn't talk for 9 months. She must have been so concerned. She must have been so, what is going on, Zach? I have a feeling she got a long letter that night. And I have a feeling he wrote out everything. And then before too long, one morning Elizabeth gets up and she's a little bit nauseous. And before too long, she says, Zechariah, I'm about to have a child. And Zechariah and Elizabeth experience what God can do when we'll worship. When we'll hear his word with wonder. And when we'll be willing to do our part. When all of that comes together, you know what happens? Miracles. Miracles. Am I talking to somebody today? Someone today who needs a miracle? You're in the right place. You're at the place of worship. Listen carefully. God's speaking. then go out. Do your part. And you'll be amazed at what God can do in your life. You know what the problem is? We think miracles are something that happens in somebody else's life. We know that God had power yesterday. We know God will have power in the future. We believe this. I guarantee you, every one of us really believe this story happened. Every one of us really believe that one day Jesus is going to come back. Our problem is, what can he do in our life today? I always think about the story of Mary and Martha when Lazarus had died. Jesus shows up and Mary goes out to greet him, and she said, Lord, if you had been here, you could have helped him from dying. You could have saved him. She believed God had power in the past. Jesus says, well, he'll live again. Mary says, I know he'll live again in the resurrection. She believes God will have power in the future. Her problem was she couldn't come to grips with the fact that God wanted to do something in her life today. Today. And that's what God wants to do in yours. Today. He wants to reach out and touch you and answer your prayer today. Are you listening for the voice? Are you willing to do whatever it takes? If you are, you can indeed see the impossible.